Well, thank you, Karina. Really appreciate to be here for the invitation and the warm words that you share with the participants. Thank you, delegates, for this wonderful time that you share with us. Just share with you the slides. Sure. All right. Thank you, Karina, as said, and I'm very happy to be here. I followed the previous session, very rich in history and a lot of learning. The weather is nice now here. It's a bit cold and raining, so it felt like a movie. So what I'm going to share with you and discuss is something quite different, radically different from what we saw from the previous session. I'm going to talk about something happening right now and something that continues to threaten our very existence and our good life, if I may put it that way. The COVID-19 and how it has disrupted the food that we consume, the food systems. And I'm going to present something based on a global South city. As you heard, I'm a cities person. I do food, I do climate change and other things. So I'm going to focus on one of the themes, which is food and the city. And on top of that, a layer on COVID-19 and how it's affecting the most vulnerable populations in our city space. This picture was taken last year during the peak of COVID-19 in Zambia, and when the city was really disrupted. And so in terms of the food question, what you see in the picture is part of what we eat in Zambia. The red stuff is the tomato. It's basically eaten by each and every household in the city. It's an important food type. There are grains and sardines and small fish and grains. That's really what we eat. What motivated me to look at this study, I wrote a paper and a report on this, is that international organizations have made a strong argument, such as organizations like FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, have argued that among the most disrupted systems and urban systems in this case is the food. Food systems are strongly and highly disrupted by COVID-19. And the risk of starvation and complete loss of urban livelihoods is particularly high for people who live and work informally. And we are talking of 1.2 billion people globally. These are living in congested, overcrowded, informal settlements, where food in itself, livelihoods are continuously hanging by the thread. And where water, sanitation, where basically the measures to protect oneself from the pandemic are basically very difficult to actualize. And so food really becomes a major issue. The second point that I want to raise is that of the 1.2 billion people living globally living globally in informal settlements, and of the 3 million people living in the city of Lusaka, 72% of the people living in the city of Lusaka live in informal settlements. They live in these crowded and serviced urban centers. And their livelihoods continuously hang by the thread, and it's difficult for them to survive. That is under normal circumstances, the normal abnormal. Now, when we add the COVID-19 problem on top of the already problematic living condition, life really becomes extremely difficult. And when we look at food, we say, what are people eating? Do they have an option? And so in this study, the conceptualization of food security is that people are food secure when they have physical and socioeconomic access to what they desire to eat. They have physical and socioeconomic access to nutritious food. And they have physical and economic access to their dietary needs. not just for the sake of feeding the body, but also having a choice to choose food of their preference and food that is healthy and safe. Now, in conditions of high uncertainty, with the informality as a key driver of what happens in these urban spaces, what we end up seeing during COVID-19 crisis is that food even becomes more disrupted. And to shed more light on that, we did a study on four major urban markets where food is largely traded. Without these markets, there would definitely be food insecurity in the city of Lusaka. Did a study on Soweto market, did a study on other markets, as you can see written there. The study was funded by HIVOS. I was commissioned to do a study, but also to publish out of the same. We did a lot of document reviews to understand how food is organized, how food is traded, and what are the determinants of both socioeconomic and physical access to food. And the responses were recorded digitally on Google Forms. And so in terms of Lusaka, really, as I already said, we are looking at 2 million people. And the city, we are looking at 3 million people in the city. And by 2035, we are looking at 5.4 million people. The city is growing at 4.9%. And as I said, the surveys that have been done indicate that 70% of the food that is eaten in Lusaka, 70% food is actually purchased. So really people depend on the market to access the food. 25% is home produced. A bit of home gardens, backyard gardens, and so on and so forth, and a bit of small farms by the urban edge. And 5% is gifted, typically in form of money. That is some sort of support. And an important point to make here is that residents of Lusaka access food from a combination of outlets. There are small neighborhood markets, which we typically call here as Kantemba. There are local shops. There are also supermarkets. And there are also streets where you actually get food. Now, you see these sources, the way we've designed and built our cities. Food is typically traded. Little is locally produced. Like you can see, 70% is basically, people survive by buying food on the market. But where are these markets? It's small shops, it's streets, and a bit of markets. Now, the 72% of those living informally mostly depend on street markets, open air markets, and less on supermarkets. So when COVID-19 hits, you'll be able to see what we found, the level of disruption and the level of threat on hunger and nutrition for the people of the city of Lusaka. And to add to that problem, various international organizations, including on research, classify Zambia in general as one of the most hungriest countries in the world, with 46% of the population said to be living in hunger situations at some times of the year. And when 46% are actually considered food insecure, and almost 92% considered nutrition insecure, and then you add COVID-19 on top, then you see a problem. And then on top of that, the people depend on food that is purchased. So then how should we be thinking about future Lusaka in terms of design, building, management of the city with the possibility of future pandemics? That's the monster, that's the question that we face for tomorrow. The Brookings Institution made an observation that applies to Lusaka. It says, in African cities, the informal sector forms the backbone of the economy and provides most employment. If previous crises are a guide, the loss of employment and income is likely to have a serious and widespread impact on access to food, as they reduce the ability of vulnerable groups to purchase sufficient calories, let alone nutritious food. They were reflecting on COVID-19. African cities, this is a situation for the African cities, and something that we ought to pay particular attention to. Now, during the survey, what did we get? We realized that in terms of food that is mostly traded, It's fruits and vegetables. It's beef and meat products. It's poultry, such as eggs, chicken, and so on and so forth. Now, this is typically reflecting a diet, what people eat. Eat fish, eat beans, eat vegetables, and so on and so forth. But don't forget, most of these products are basically accessed through the market. They really typically don't grow their own food. Then in terms of COVID-19 impact, how did the availability and the physical access of these foods on the market, how did the COVID-19 impact? The survey indicated that 66% of the people that we interviewed indicate and suffered from increased cost. The increased cost was attributed and attributable to disrupted supply. Food cannot be supplied in same quantities and type as, during COVID-19 and during times that, we didn't have the pandemic. And the supply that was disrupted makes food now expensive. The other one is those who deal in food in order to make an income, therefore manage to live, recorded reduced margins because the cost of accessing the food from the suppliers became expensive. And some storage also becomes a challenge because the markets are not fully operational and the services are disrupted. Then by the end of the day, what we get is the prices for consumers becomes a challenge. So the traders, the food dealers also operating informally suffer from one, they lose business, they lose income that enables them access the food, and then the cost of doing business actually sharply rises. That becomes a huge problem. Now, amidst the pandemic, what was the expected response by the people living and working informally in this setting? The first thing that we found is that the people are expected to wash their hands regularly. They are expected to wear masks. They are expected to keep social distance. Now, these measures are highly inappropriate. Why? One, wearing masks were not for free, they're expensive. And people had their income already disrupted. That becomes a big problem. Second, regular washing of hands. You can see those on the image below there, you have buckets. Those are people in one of the informal settlements where we did this study, people queuing to access the water. So how would they wash their hands when water itself is a big problem? And this is a communal water point. The other thing that we see on the bottom on your right is the shallow well. Basically, people make a makeshift water point and they're able to draw. And the water is typically polluted and dirty and mixes with the debris and so on and so forth. So we expect people to wash hands, but look at the water and sanitation situation. Then to make matters worse, some of the communal water points, like you can see top on your right, that's the water kiosk. That is typically deserted and dry. There's no water flowing, but we expect people to wash their hands. So the measures are extremely difficult, to actualize because the living conditions are tough. Even how to keep the food clean, safe, and how to handle the food, all those measures are highly inappropriate. But they are sort of been imposed by the scientists. We, the people who are reading and writing, make these recommendations, but really understand what is supposed to happen on the table before the people can actually make actualization of what we recommend. In terms of what the local government is able to do, you see 100%. We made a suggestion that a list of things that are supposed to be done. What can the local government, the Lusaka City Council, do in order to help the people in those circumstances? So they're able to handle food food in a manner that guarantees safety and high standards of hygiene. The city is unable to, the design and the way the market has been built, it is extremely difficult to actually actualize social distance. The markets are congested. That's the design part. There is over-politicization of the markets, particularly before the change of government in August. Previously, it was really difficult even to do research in the markets or politics. Then supply of water and sanitation, like I showed you, is a big problem and they cannot afford. And essentially what we are saying, the city is highly unprepared to actually address the issues. Then the question is, how did the nutrition get affected? Nutrition, by and large, that people reduced. Instead of eating 3 meals, minimum 3 meals a day, that is breakfast, lunch, and dinner, people cut. 57 of the respondents cut to having a meal in a day or maybe maximum 2. And instead of diversifying the plate, they would go for the cheapest. Those are things that we're finding. And that affects the well-being and even the ability of the body to fight the pandemic, making cities really hotspots in terms of spread, in terms of death, and in terms of capacity to actually build back and bounce back, because the challenges are a bit numerous. And having less than 3 meals a day is such a difficult thing in a situation where the supply of food is itself insufficient and where household size can be as much as 6, 7, in some cases even up to 10. Then you only have maybe 2 meals or sometimes 1 meal because the pandemic has disrupted the traditional supply and sources of what people really eat. Despite all these challenges, people have an idea how we can build and build better. The first one, their argument is that there is need to diversify the business. People are struggling in these informal communities, and they sometimes sell only one commodity, maybe only tomatoes or maybe only spinach. So they argue that we need to go beyond the food, do other things as a way of earning income. Then they argue that there's need to think of innovative ways of ensuring their business so that during times of crisis, at least they have some sort of a lifeline that can support access to their food. In terms of how we can build better, what are the suggestions in terms of the urban space, rethinking the urban space? One is that households need to become, food self-sustaining. Issues to do with the backyard garden need to be emphasized, including sack gardening, as part of greening and part of growing own food. Even 3-4 sacks growing 3-4 vegetable plants, leaf vegetable plants, that can allow somebody not to get out of the yard, especially when there's a lockdown, to actually source the food from within the place where they may live. We are aware sometimes informal settlements can be congested, but there is something that can be done. People have argued even on rooftop, planting something on the rooftop and so on and so forth. How do we then need to think creatively to ensure that people are able to get something out of their own yard and be able to survive, and like 70% depending on the market? The second thing is diversifying the livelihood systems, going beyond food trading. The other thing is investing in what we have described in this report as urban tourism, particularly slum tourism, where people can, during better days when the COVID-19 is not there, these informal settlements can serve as important tourist sites. And people can create some savings out of that, and cultures can be impacted to learn how others live in different spaces. And the income from those, from the urban tourism sector, including revenue from food testing these informal settlements when things are normal, that income can be saved, and people can survive when there's a complete lockdown or there's a pandemic outbreak. I should mention COVID-19 is one of them, but we also have other pandemics like the cholera outbreak, which happens basically every year. And we seem not to learn much. So during dry, good times, how can urban tourism and slum tourism be sort of invested in order to allow people to make an income, make a saving, and be able to survive during times when things are difficult? Then there's a need to be critical and conscious that the so-called global measures or adopted measures at global scale and sometimes at national scale, there's a need to think local specific locations, how are people living in these communities, and what is it that can work and what is that can't work, and these which cannot work, how can we adapt them in order for them, the measures actually to make a difference. And as I conclude, the people are very conscious that they can build better, and building better and being more prepared after COVID-19, some of the propositions that there's need to rethink the design of the market so that we allow for some sort of social distance, the social distancing within those markets. They are really congested and they become a hotspot for disease spread. Then there's need to sensitize and educate the people about the dangers that await them should they don't change the way of life and diversify the economies and also get some little bit of support from the state. And then food system, urban transport need to be something which should be at the center, because when lockdowns happen, when disruptions happen, some of the key things to get disrupted is just mobility. And since food is basically traded in the city of Lusaka, it's not really locally produced. And if transport is disrupted, then how would the people get the food? Maybe thinking green and thinking of the city that depends largely on walking, given that 68% of the people in the city actually walk, but there is not really infrastructure for them to walk. So these are some of the things that have been pushed forward, that if we are rigorous on creating a city that allows people to walk, creating a city and the community that are, and market spaces that allow people to, to have some sort of space in between them, and therefore naturally have measures to protect themselves from the pandemic as well as other diseases. That could be, allow these markets not to be hotspots, but the spaces where people can trade and access food without major disruptions. And I want to thank you for listening. Suffice to say that what I've presented is based on a research that was commissioned by a Dutch organization, HIVOS, and the report has already been written and the paper has been submitted where we make some of the arguments that I present here. Thank you so much. Over to you, Karin.